Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I will follow up on much of what Craig Ritchie already said, but this will be from a much more practical point of view as a medical doctor. What are the challenges with early diagnosis at the moment, and where do we stand right now with the new emerging concepts of Alzheimer's disease? So first of all, when we talk about improving the diagnosis, we need to be precise about what we mean by early diagnosis, and therefore also how we can diagnose a dementia, how early we can diagnose a dementia disorder, depending on what we are talking about. And then once we have reached the diagnosis, we need to provide the proper information, support, and treatment. And this is actually the key element of diagnosis, to provide information and support for the patient and the family in order for them to cope with the condition. So this I will also touch upon, and finally, of course, part of this information and support is, of course, medical and non-medical treatment, and I will also focus on this. So, when I talk about the importance of a timely diagnosis, I don't consider medical treatment as the most important reason for an early diagnosis. The current anti-dementia treatment seems not to be very useful in the very early phases of a dementia disorder. However, support for subjects with complaints and their families starts at the very moment they feel something is wrong. And again, this is the most important reason for an early evaluation. This may be evident to all of you in this audience, but I can assure you that I struggle with my colleagues every day trying to make them understand that early diagnosis is not all about medical treatment. However, the earlier we try to find the cause for these complaints, the more difficult it gets, as very mild symptoms may be due to many different conditions like depression, stress, alcohol, and sleep problems. That does not mean it should not be taken serious. Actually, on the contrary, resources used to finding these causes for these early and mild problems are very well-spent resources, as treatable causes can be identified, and support and information can help the subject and the family to cope with these symptoms by understanding the cause behind them. And that doesn't matter whether this is depression or a dementia disorder. They need to understand what the cause is. So, now it gets a bit more complicated. You have seen versions of this graph many times before, because the issue of a timely diagnosis depends on what we diagnose. As we have heard from Craig Ritchie also, we can detect changes in the brain 20 to 30 years before any symptoms occur in Alzheimer's disease. And now I'm talking only about Alzheimer's disease. It's probably the same in other disorders, but we know less on these disorders. So these changes are actually very easy to detect. So the brain changes can be detected by brain scan. You only need a PET scanner or lumbar puncture, and then you can detect these early changes in the brain, which is now in the new terminology called Alzheimer's disease. What we detect here is a risk factor for symptoms that may or may not occur many years after in a healthy subject. And this is very important to recognize. Once the first mild symptoms occur, the symptoms can also be detected. Although this is often a bit more complicated, it requires specialized evaluations such as neuropsychology testing. But the most difficult thing actually here is, which is really difficult, is to combine these first mild symptoms with the brain changes so that we can say that the brain changes are the cause of the symptoms. And I know this might sound a bit technical, but this is what we are challenged with and faced with every day when we are going to diagnose. And let me give you an example of this. So many years ago, actually, I saw a man. He was 72 years old. He was complaining of memory problems. And when I examined him clinically, he had memory problems, but otherwise he was doing very fine, and he lived a normal and active life with his wife. So I gave him a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, and I told him that we wanted to follow up on him because of his memory impairment and that he had a mildly increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. So I followed him over the next couple of years, and there was only this mild impairment with no increase in his symptoms. So actually in 2008, we had access to amyloid imaging. So we were now able to look at the Alzheimer pathology. And I discussed with him, do you want to know if you have this very early pathology of Alzheimer's disease? And eventually he said, yes, I would like to know. And then I did a PET scan on him, and I found this huge amount of amyloid in the brain. But at that time, around the time I did the scan, all his memory problems disappeared. It turned out that he had very stressful family affairs and problems, and they kind of solved, and with that, all his memory problems went away. So what I diagnosed was not early Alzheimer's dementia, but was rather a risk factor for Alzheimer's, which may or may not cause Alzheimer's in maybe 10 or 15 years. So the question is, of course, did I do something good for this man? Well, it depends on what grounds he made his decision. In other words, I hope he made his decision after careful discussion with me and after I provided him with all the information that I could give him as a dementia specialist, including the uncertainty of whether his symptoms were related to a dementia disorder. So I believe this case shows that why we should be very careful to either limit this kind of evaluation to specialists, or perhaps even better, make all doctors specialists so that they are able to convey this kind of information so that the patient and the family are able to make their own decision whether they want this information or not. And maybe it's a bit optimistic to hope for every doctor to be able to this, but until then we need specialists to make this kind of careful examination and evaluation and information. So, to sum up, and you have seen this slide, and you have to show this Clifford Jack slide every time. So when a person has significant memory problems or cognitive problems, we can use this pathology investigation, biomarker investigations, to make the diagnosis more certain in cases where we are not completely certain of the symptoms. So that's on the right side of this slide. In subjects with milder cognitive problems, we need to inform very careful about the consequences of finding this pathology behind the symptoms. It could be early treatment, more focused counseling, and the ability to plan for the future. On the other hand, we should be very careful to engage the subjects and the family in this decision to get the pathology diagnosis, as this may also have negative consequences in some such as depression or anxiety. But in my opinion and my experience, when people, they experience these symptoms, and I think we just heard it from the previous speaker, that when they experience symptoms that are unfamiliar and unexplained, they often have more anxiety. And most people, they want to know, and we heard this in this conference also, most people want to know what's wrong. So, but we need to give the information to them in a way so that they can make the decision themselves. So when we turn to the healthy subjects, we just heard about a very large study on healthy subjects with no symptoms or very, very mild symptoms. And at this point in time, it's not recommended to investigate pathology biomarkers just because people would like to know or they are worried. But in very special circumstances, as we have heard earlier at this conference, they can be used to find people with higher risk for Alzheimer and include them in this scientific research or medical trials. But this is a different area which Craig Ritchie just told you about. So, once we have made the diagnosis, what is it that we have to offer? And I must admit, I borrowed this slide from Alzheimer Scotland, which very nicely depicts the things that we can offer as support for the family and the person with memory problems or cognitive problems. It's the planning for future decision-making, support, community connections, understanding the illness and managing the symptoms, planning for future care and peer support. And all these aspects require an accurate diagnosis. But it's not something that we provide at the memory clinics. It is a collaboration between care organizations, community settings, A lot of different collaborators and different sectors are in play here. And actually one of the issues here is the collaboration between these sectors, which is a challenge. And when we come to medical treatment, of course, we should also make that as an offer. It's not like it's not something you should do, but we often hear that medical treatment should be started early, and people tend to believe that when you start too late, the medication doesn't work anymore. This is not true. Actually, most of the anti-dementia drugs, they work very well also in more advanced cases. The problem is that this is a symptomatic treatment. So what the medication does is it stabilizes the symptoms, and early stabilization at a level where you have a higher function is actually better than at a later stage where you don't gain so much. So this is the reason why early treatment is better than later treatment. Likewise, when we talk about non-medical treatment, and we heard about reducing risk factors, and there are two ways of looking at this, and I think Craig Ritchie very nicely depicted this. I don't have as many boxes as he has, but one of the things is that we know some of these risk factors. We know age and gender and genetic risk factors are at play here, but there are other risk factors as well, such as cardiovascular risk factors, physical inactivity, lack of cognitive stimulation, and social isolation. And the question is, if we focus on changing these risk factors in subjects who are getting these, starting to get symptoms, could we then see an effect on the course of disease by slowing the progression of the symptoms? And there are kind of two ways of looking at this. And number one here is where you have these risk factors starting the disease. And once the disease has started, it would continue without any modifiable way of changing the course of the disease. So the risk factors are at play very early in the disease. But another way of explaining this is that which is more in line with what now we think of Alzheimer's disease. It is a continuum of a very perhaps lifelong development of changes in the brain. And these changes, they are affected by these risk factors. So if we want to change the disease course, we can actually modify the disease course by modifying the risk factors also when we start to have symptoms. So how do we know this? Well, from my own view, we have looked at the physical activity. We know that physical inactivity is an important risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, and if you are physical active, you have a 30% reduced risk of developing Alzheimer in later life. So does physical activity benefit you once you have developed your symptoms? And we and others have shown actually that yes, by being physical active as a treatment, you can actually improve the symptoms even though you, of course, you have the symptoms, you have the disease. So it's kind of linking the prevention and the treatment. It's more or less the same if you think of Alzheimer's disease as a continuum. So this is something that we have to convey to the patient and the caregivers once they reach the diagnosis, because this is also important as a part of the treatment and support. So, what are the challenges? Well, I can only speak for Denmark, but I'm assuming that it's the same challenges you have in all other countries in Europe. I mean, we still have a lot of misconceptions, taboos, and barriers for elevation of cognitive problems. And I know that even though we here in this audience, I mean, we can speak about it, but I can assure you that it's a big problem when you go to your general practitioner in Denmark, and many general practitioners say, oh, well, please remember you are getting old. We all lose our memory when we get old. No, we don't. So I think it's a big problem still. Then the possibilities for evaluation and support vary very much from area to area because we have expert centers, but the knowledge and the experience from these expert centers is not carried forward from the centers to less experienced centers, at least in our country. And then, of course, we have the resources for care and support. They have diminished over the years in many places. And as also mentioned earlier, special support for, and care for young subjects is something that we really lack. So this is an important point also. And then this communication between sectors is simply not good enough. We have severe problems with communicating between primary and secondary sectors, for instance. So what are the solutions? Well, we have had health authority guidelines on diagnosis, treatment, and support. The latest ones were in 2013. So this is all very well, but the problem is that you need to back it up. You need to back it up with national plan that looks at all areas of dementia, on all aspects of those, and you have to back it up with money. So this is something that you already heard about is going on right now here in Denmark, and these plans will focus on early diagnosis and support, which is what we're talking about right now. And they also suggest that we actually should have fewer expert evaluation centers, exactly to try to gather this expert knowledge and the information that we will be able to give to the patients for them to make a decision is something that you cannot divide out into all smaller centers, because they simply don't have the knowledge. If you don't understand what you're talking about, you cannot convey that information. And finally, we need to have focus on transition between these sectors with active involvement and support of people with dementia and their families. I mean, this is a very high priority too. So actually asking the people with dementia, what do they want? So, to conclude, timely diagnosis means timely support, and a correct diagnosis is a requirement for correct support. And support includes information. This is a key element, and this will help to increase the independent decision-making early in the course. Diagnosis of subject with very mild cognitive symptoms should be preceded by careful information and involvement of the subject and the family. This is also very important. And treatment is much more than medication. Reducing risk factors may actually improve symptoms. This is something we all should include in our counseling. And then the national plans at the highest political level are necessary to improve the quality of diagnosis, treatment, care, and support. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.